Beside Aisha, you have people like Hafsa, Salama, and others. All these women did affect the Prophet. You remember during the time of Hudaybiyah, when the Muslims went in full force hoping to go into the Kaaba and perform the rituals, but they were stopped at the edges of the city by Abu Sufyan and the other leaders of Mecca. And of course, there was a lot of confusion among the Muslims. It was one of the wives of the Prophet who advised him to go and slaughter his animal. And then, of course, Ali followed suit, and then the other Sahabas who were really in a state of confusion at that time because they were very much down. The role and place of the woman. A woman in the house of the Prophet became a source of inspiration and encouragement for him at that time. This is in the Hadith literature. Now, when we look at the role and place of women during the time of the Prophet, we can move outside of the household of the Prophet, and we now begin to look at other women who existed contemporaneously with the Prophet. We have the case of Waraha, who has been used now in the West. She has begun to be discovered from obscurity, and you have debates among some of the Muslims whether women should be that or should not be that. And of course, Waraha is sometimes quoted. The hadith about her is brought into the discussion as to the role and place of women at the time of the Prophet and the examples of some of those women for contemporary Muslim women. Now, she enters the literature in this context. This was the woman who was told by the Prophet that she could lead her household in prayer. And in her household, you had a boy, you had a girl, and of course you have a muezzin, who must be a man. And the idea is, here you have a woman who could lead prayers and stand in front of a boy who is a man. And of course, we have people now in America, people like Kawkab Siddiqui and others, who will use that hadith and say, on the basis of this hadith, which is a true hadith, women should lead prayers. But of course, the ulama who are familiar with this hadith knew that this was a particular incident, a particular case. You cannot use that particular case and make a generalization that women are eligible to lead prayers. And of course, this is how Kawkab Siddiqui has been criticized by many of our contemporary scholars of fiqh and students of the Sharia, because you're taking an isolated case, an isolated hadith, where a woman is given authority by the Prophet to lead prayer and try to make a universal case out of it. But the case of Waraka is part of our history, part of the relationship between women and men, and part of the example set by the Prophet. Now, women played many other roles in the life of the emerging Islamic community in Mecca and in Medina. Now, if you look at the women's role in Mecca, when the Muslims were very small as a community, you can see the courageous role that was played by some of these Muslim women. We already talked about Khadija bankrolling the Prophet, serving as comforter, consoler, emotional support for the Prophet. But we also have to remember when that the Islamic movement was underground, and they used to meet in the house called Darul Arqam, which was an underground cell of the Muslims. Arqam owned property around the Kaaba. And Muslims used to meet in his house. It wasn't underground, what they call now in America a safe house. When you have an underground movement, they have a safe house. And Darul Arham was a safe house, an underground cell for the Muslims. And of course, you know the revelation. Let me wrap up quickly. You know the story about the sister of Umar bin Khattab, who was part of that Darul Arham underground. And of course, she became a Muslim secretly, unbeknown to Omar. That time Omar was not a Muslim. And Omar was one day very determined to go and kill the Prophet. And he was so enraged and so determined to go and do that. But on the way, because he knew about this Darul Arham underground, so as he was heading towards Darul Arham, someone told him, "You want to get Muhammad? You better go and fix your sister. She's a Muslim." Omar was very enraged. So he rushed towards the sister's house. And when he got there, they were already reciting Suratul Taha. He overheard what was being read. So when he got inside the house, the sister, the husband, and another Sahaba who were reciting the Quran were accosted, and of course the brother-in-law was attacked to the point that blood was coming out. And his sister, Omar's sister, tried to separate him from the from the husband. And of course, Omar bin Khattab insisted that he wanted to see what they were reciting. The sister refused to give him the text because they say, "You are not a Muslim. You have to be cleansed." So he went and he cleaned himself, and then he came back. They gave him the ayat of Surah Al-Taha. They were reciting. Omar was so overwhelmed by this ayat that he rushed to Darul Arham. And of course, Muslims were suspicious of him. And Hamza stood between him and the Prophet and said, "If you want to get in, to kill him, I finish you first." The Prophet moved him away from Umar. And Umar came in and submitted to Islam. Now this shows you that the Muslim women were actively involved in that revolutionary cell as the men. Because Umar's sister preceded him in Islam. So his sister was a Muslim before him. And you know Umar is now a great hero among Muslims. But how many Muslims know the sister? That's history. That's what happened to movements. Sometimes the people who come into the movement first are forgotten. And those who come later are more recognized. And this happened to the sister of Umar. Because there are very few Muslims who know the sister's name, or this story I just narrated. Now, the point I'm making here is that